Hi everyone, Blind Dweller here. For today's video, I wanted to honour another popular request on this channel that I've seen pop up quite a few times in my videos. Today I wanted to discuss and share some works by one of the most fascinating painters and sculpturists within the realms of dark and unsettling art. An artist who would explore and push boundaries within a genre of art known as fantastic realism. An artist who would create biomechanical worlds of architecture and ominous beings from another universe that would continue to influence many creatives who reside even beyond the art world. Of course, the artist I'm referring to is the famous Swiss artist H.R. Giger. Even if you haven't heard of him before, you may have certainly seen his art before. Or more to the point, if you're a fan of the Alien movies, then you'll be interested to hear that the design of the now worldwide famous creature, the Xenomorph, is a concept of Giger's incredibly dark and visceral imagination. In fact, the design of many of the sets, props and architecture, especially within the first film, were all made possible because of the artist we'll be looking at today. I will be truthful though, although I'm a huge fan of the Alien movies, until recently I have not been overly that familiar with his other work. In fact, it was only because of the behind the scenes features in my Alien DVD collection that I was first ever introduced to his art. Having said that though, since whenever I have come across his work again every so often, whether that be in a book on his work or me just scrolling through Instagram, there is always something so striking to me about his style. And so for today, as per popular request, I'd like to share and discuss some of the most brutal and mysterious artworks of H.R. Giger, as well as shedding some light on the story behind his career and what may have influenced imagery so doom-inducing that it would inspire a design for one of the most terrifying movie monsters in pop culture. Welcome to another video everyone. These are the monsters of H.R. Giger. Before we get stuck in, I'd just like to quickly apologise profusely in advance for any potential mispronunciations of any names, words or places in this video. For some reason, mispronouncing certain words is a curse of mine. Like, no matter how many times I look up the correct way to pronounce a certain word or name, it's always hit or miss every time. So as always, if I do say anything wrong, just let me and the others know in the comments below. Hans Rudi Giger was born in Chur in Switzerland on February 5th, 1940, to parents Hans Richard Giger and Melly Giger Meyer. He would also have an older sister named Iris, who was 7 years his senior. Despite having a strict father, who would prove later down the line to have little patience for art, Giger and his older sister were treated kindly by their parents, living a somewhat modest life in an apartment above the pharmacy where their father worked as a chemist. However, other sources state that, as Giger was born during the midst of the Second World War, his mother was constantly worried about the risk of a bomb attack, and so Giger and his family would spend most of his earliest years in Flims, a ski region about half an hour away from Chur. The exact details of the trauma that Giger experienced in his childhood varies from source to source, it would seem, though it is commonly agreed that his upbringing during World War II would contribute heavily towards his personal anxieties in his youth. The fear of an attack from their neighbouring country would constantly linger within the family, which subsequently would rub off on Giger. He would remember the light bulbs in the house being usually a bluish dark colour to help the house look invisible to any aircraft above. Not to mention that as he grew older, the threat of a Cold War would also hover over his head with the terrifying prospect of a nuclear attack. It would seem the only thing that would prove to ease his constant anxieties and nightmares was a process of sketching and drawing. In a sense, he would directly respond to his fears by reimagining them in pictures that he would alter, a trait that would prove to be the bedrock of his artistic approach later in life. Many moons later, as Giger would progress and finally graduate from school, his father, still believing art was, quote, a breadless profession, insisted his son would follow his footsteps into pharmacy. In 1962, however, Giger would instead follow his passions and study architecture and industrial design at Zurich School of Applied Arts. Shortly afterwards, in the mid-60s, he would operate as an interior designer. In his spare time though, Giger would frequently practice and fine-tune his distinct style and craft by producing ink drawings, oil paintings, and polyester sculptures. It would not be until the tail end of the 60s that Giger, with the help of persuasion from his close friend Basilio Schmid, would walk away from interior design altogether and devote himself fully to his art. By this time, Giger was perfecting a style that he would later define as biomechanical, creating creatures and scenery that ride the fine line between being organic and robotic, almost cyborgian, if that's even a word. Alright, I guess it is then. Okay, cool. In 1969, Giger would receive further help from another close friend in getting his art off the ground, an art collector named H. Kuntz. He was also a co-owner of Switzerland's first poster publishing company, who would distribute Giger's first posters worldwide. It would not be until well into the 1970s though, that the world would begin to take full notice of his truly one-of-a-kind imagination. What I also find so interesting about H.R. Giger is, as well as having a unique style of art, his career in itself is also quite unique compared to most other artists, at least the ones that I normally feature on this channel. Although Giger would first start featuring his art in galleries as the 70s went on, with his quasi-sexual imagery at first being regarded as so offensive by the locals that some would even spit on the gallery's windows when they walked by. The main key to his success was his later contributions towards movie concept art. Not to mention, by this time, he was forging his status as one of the world's leading airbrush artists, with his signature style of intricate, ethereal visions of the macabre, depicted with a minimal but effective palette of murky greys and deep blacks. However, before we dive into Giger's movie concept art endeavours, it would be more appropriate to take a look at one of his earliest commissioned works that came to be in 1973, with his artwork used for the rock band Emerson, Lake and Palmer and their album titled Brain Salad Surgery. The band would meet Giger in April that year when playing a concert in Zurich, where Giger at this time was currently residing. Band member Keith Emerson and their manager would visit the artist's home after the concert, and they would be spellbound by what they saw. One such early work Emerson was drawn to was Giger's skull triptych titled Landscape 19. When Emerson first saw it, he knew Giger would be the perfect fit for the artwork of their new album. Emerson would comment on the visit as follows: "My promoter friend insisted on driving me to Giger's house. I remember it was a fairly modest bungalow from the outside, until you went in. The interior decor was overpowering, gothic to the extreme. From floor to ceiling, his unique airbrush technique had transformed a simple room into a cathedral. Giger had gone three-dimensional. His toilet had arms coming out, almost engulfing the sitter. I noticed the arms had drip feeds going into them. Other decor consisted of gas masks." End quote. Now, I'm not overly familiar with Emerson, Lake and Palmer. It's not my kind of music, to be truthful. As a result, I don't own a copy of this particular album myself, so I'll mostly be focusing on the artwork here, but I'll quickly give some context to the album as described in the February 2020 article on loudersound.com titled How H.R. Giger and ELP Created the Brain Surgery Salad Cover. The original album came housed in an elaborate design. The outer sleeve featured a piece of Giger's monochromatic, biomechanical artwork that boasted a human skull within an industrial mechanism. However, in the center was a circle depicting the flesh and blood face that would have covered the skeleton. The original sleeve was split down the middle, both sides opening outwards, revealing underneath a human female face, sometimes rumoured to be the face of Giger's then wife, actress Lee Tobler, with alien-like hair and various facial markings, assumed to be scars. Already we can see the trademark imagery that would become more and more familiar, with the metallic, skeletal patterns presented in the inside image and the relict, industrial-looking details on the outside work. Though this finished product we're now presented with would go through an interesting transformation beforehand. As the article continues to reveal, the original title for the LP was Whip Some Skull on Ya, basically a euphemism for fellatio. Giger found such concepts in art thrilling to experiment with, and would later comment on the experience as follows. The obvious thing was to combine lips, the male member, and skulls. Those elements flowed into the picture. Nevertheless, Keith suddenly informed me that the title of the album was going to be Brain Salad Surgery. I was dismayed until he explained to me that this expression likewise connoted fellatio. End quote. Incidentally, the artwork would at first consist of a robotic phallus beneath the chin of a lady's face on the outer sleeve, situated just above the new rounded ELP logo that Giger had also created. Although this was not replicated on the lady's face on the inner sleeve, it nevertheless caused problems for the band with their record company. To quote Emerson once again, after much deliberation, we reluctantly had to appeal to H.R. Giger to tone down the phallic object in front of the subject's mouth until it looked like a shaft of light. End quote. Only a year before one of Giger's biggest breaks of his career, the 9-year relationship between him and his wife Lee ended tragically with her taking her own life. An event known as the Second Celebration of the Four would be held among Giger's circle of friends in Richtersville, which simultaneously represented the inauguration of the club and a memorial for Lee. Although Giger would remarry in later years, the loss of Lee would leave a terrible emptiness within Giger. Over time and on many occasions, imagery of Lee would make appearances in his paintings. However, by 1977, word of his talent and skill would not cease to continue reaching every corner of the world. That same year, he had also released his first major published book on his artwork, titled Necronomicon. Now, this book is actually something I wanted to get a copy of myself, but when I looked online, the average hardback copy cost nearly 500 quid. There's just no way, I'm not bloody made of money, though thankfully I did manage to find a few bits and pieces from within this book while scavenging online. The book would be a massive success, with many copies released in many languages across the world. There are so many wonderful examples of his artwork within this book, so before we jump straight into how he worked on the Alien movie, I think it's worth taking a quick look around. This one is titled A. Crowley, The Beast 666, completed in 1975, and inspired by one of history's most infamous occultists, Aleister Crowley, who, bizarrely enough, also created some strange and surreal paintings himself. A video idea for the future maybe? Let me know in the comments. Either way, Giger would apparently cross these paintings of Crowley, and would also garner great interest in magic and the occult, which again would be made clearly evident by the many illustrations of his within Necronomicon. What Giger found within Crowley's works were mostly portraits of Crowley's friends, whom Giger couldn't help but notice were made to look very evil. Paintings of women too were very sinister looking, as opposed to Giger's frequent style of presenting them as elegant and almost goddess-like beings. So for me, whenever I look at this particular piece, it appears to be almost like discovering what it might look like within the mind of someone like Crowley, who both fascinated and eluded Giger. Comparatively similar to Crowley in some aspects, Giger was also fascinated in ancient Egypt, something that could be relayed in his imagery displayed in Biomechanoid 3, according to one source I found, titled Alien Explorations. When Giger was roughly 6 years old, his older sister, Iris, took him to see a mummified Egyptian woman at the Leicester Museum in Kure. The mummy was down in a basement with amputated hands and feet. Giger would be immediately horrified, but Iris laughed at him. Feeling his pride had been somewhat mocked by her, the young Giger every Sunday would go to see the mummy before closing time, and stand right in front of it for long periods of time. Eventually, he would come to see it as beautiful. Giger also noted that she had, quote, an old smell about her, and this too would fascinate him. Memories of the smell would later be an inspiration for him when he started to draw and use the airbrush. He stated how he appreciated that in ancient Egypt, death was an important part of their culture, and death in turn was a huge factor of Giger's creativity. When looking at Biomechanoid 3, you could almost interpret what's presented in the center as something similar to a sarcophagus, as if honouring an alien Cleopatra who's been uncovered in some strange archaeological dig site. You could also argue that these many pipes could allude to his memories of breathing in the old smell of a mummy that remains so vivid to him since his childhood. Another breathtaking piece is titled National Park, produced in 1975. Again, we're presented with chaos, mechanical gears and tubes that protrude and weave through a wall of metal and flesh. From this example alone, we can see so many reminiscent features that make us think of the Alien movies. And as it so happens, this kind of terrifying and bizarre imagery within this book of nightmares would inspire one of the most terrifying science fiction movies of all time. During the early stages of making a 1979 movie, Alien, its director Ridley Scott was handed one of the very first copies of Necronomicon by screenwriter Dan O'Bannon during a discussion on what exactly the alien creature would look like. Upon opening the book and discovering the hair-raising image of what would be known as Necronomicon 4, completed in 1976, the concept of the Xenomorph would be realised. Its phallic head, its snarling mouth, and its creepy yet extraordinarily beautiful body shape would be just what Scott and O'Bannon had in mind for the monster of their movie, and were convinced that this strange and allegedly disturbed artist named Giger was the perfect man for the job as their conceptual artist. Now, I can talk about the Alien movies till the cows come home. It's one of my favourite franchises ever, but I want this video to be mostly focused on Giger and his art, so I'll try to keep this brief and concise. As mentioned in a behind-the-scenes documentary called The Beast Within, The Making of Alien, Ridley Scott was adamant that Giger need not have to illustrate any fresh or new ideas for the movie. So enamoured and stunned by Giger's work, he wanted the alien elements to be exactly how we saw it in the book, seeing the quote, humanoid biomechanoid insect as threatening but also beautiful with sexual connotations, fitting the notion of this beast being one that is designed by nature to stab and claw out of the body of another living being. Scott would fly to Zurich to meet Giger for himself. When he arrived at Giger's house, he too would be amazed by the various sculptures, paintings and ornaments that were displayed everywhere around the house. Giger, as always, was excited with the project and more than happy to help, but again it was made perfectly clear from Scott that the existing style and look of his drawings were already perfect. He was asked therefore to design the egg, the facehugger, the chest burster, and of course, the beast itself. Giger would in fact make an appearance in the same documentary, and he would comment on his experience designing the monster as follows, quote, I didn't want it to have eyes, because it makes the monster more dangerous. It's more scary because you never know where the monster is looking. End quote. Unsurprisingly, Giger was able to design the main creature in very little time at all, adjusting only relatively small details such as the shape of the tail and the removal of the eyes. The elaborate costume of the xenomorph creature would include things like Rolls-Royce parts, rib bones, and even reptile vertebrae. Giger would then eventually make his way to England from Zurich to work on the other concept ideas with the special effects team. What was supposed to be a 3 to 4 week stay turned out to be a 7-month-long visit. Upon the film's release, it was a groundbreaking success, and would even land Giger a nomination for an Oscar in 1980. Following the success and the fame gains from Alien, I was surprised to find that the more I researched Giger, the less information I could really find in regards to his career after the release of the movie. He would of course continue to work tirelessly, releasing his artwork in exhibitions worldwide. He'd also continue releasing art books, including a sequel to Necronomicon, simply titled Necronomicon 2. Again, a very expensive book to buy nowadays, so if you have a copy of either of these books, consider yourself very lucky. Looks like they're becoming quite the collector's items. Anyway, in a sense, despite Giger gaining notable fame, his career would remain relatively quiet from that point onwards up until his death in 2014. Even when the 1986 sequel Aliens first began production, Giger was surprisingly not called upon again to be a concept artist by the film's director, James Cameron, despite Giger's award for his previous work. It would later be revealed in an apology letter from Cameron to Giger that this decision was made in order to, as Cameron put it, put his own unique stamp on the project, feeling the risk of being, quote, overwhelmed by Giger. Nevertheless, Giger would continue to work on other well-known films throughout the rest of his career, including Poltergeist 2, Alien 3, and Species, as well as a legendary unmade film, Alejandro Jodorowsky's Dune. Skipping slightly ahead here, but sticking to the subject of movies, the fourth Alien film, titled Alien Resurrection, released in 1997, would purposely leave his name out of the project, not even a notable mention. And by the way, this is probably the most batshit insane Alien movie of a bunch in my opinion. Like, even to this day, I still can't decide if I like it or not. According to mentalfloss.com, Giger didn't work on the Alien franchise's fourth installment, but he certainly had a legitimate claim that any design work owed an incredible debt to his original designs. Fox, however, seemed to disagree, omitting his name from the credits entirely. An angry Giger sent off a letter to Fox. Quote, "The creatures in Alien Resurrection are even closer to my original Alien designs than the ones that appear in Aliens and Alien 3. Why does Fox not give me the credit I rightfully earned? All I can wish them is an alien breeding inside their chests." End quote. Wow, savage Giger. I kind of respect that. Fair play. By the end of the 80s, Giger would install his first design of a total environment in Tokyo, which would be known as the Giger Bar. Though being the hard-working perfectionist he was, Giger would not be satisfied in its execution, and so he personally supervised the interior design and opening of a second bar in his hometown of Chur 4 years later. And yet another Giger bar would open in Switzerland on April 2003, known as the Museum HR Giger Bar, located in Château, in Saint-Germain of the medieval walled city of Gruyere. Just from looking at the photos of this place, I honestly think it's so impressive to see the strange living walls, the skeletal furniture, and biomechanical figures from his paintings become three-dimensional and displayed so beautifully and elegantly must be really thrilling to experience. Again, write down in the comments if you've ever been lucky enough to visit, because I'm very curious right now to maybe check it out for myself one day. As the full name of the bar suggests, it was built as a 4-story museum known as the HR Giger Museum that first opened in June 1998. And still, to this day, currently houses the largest collection of Giger's artwork than anywhere else in the world. Around the time the Giger Bar opened at the museum, many retrospectives in galleries and other museums around the globe would continue to honour his works. Giger would eventually work alongside Ridley Scott again for the 2012 Alien prequel movie, Prometheus. Before production, Giger provided over 30 concept sketches for the designs of architectural structures, transformations, and creatures. Sadly, however, by May 12, 2014, due to a complicated fall, Giger would pass away in a hospital in Zurich, taking with him an unknown quantity of unfinished and unreleased projects. HR Giger is one of those artists that not only left a legacy behind for so many aspiring artists who love to delve into the darker side of expression, but when you see the overall effect his art has had on pop culture, it really is a 1 in a billion kind of situation in my opinion. The imagery of the Xenomorph is so iconic and recognizable now, but it came from one man's imagination, an imagination that even the artist himself was reportedly afraid of. Back in the 70s, as his art finally began to reach new heights, even then no one had really ever seen anything like it. Some didn't even know how to react to his art that had so many unnerving, sexual, fantastical, and hallucinogenic overtones and themes, that also, might I add, stayed relatively consistent throughout most of his life. One of the main criticisms I hear when it comes to Giger's artwork is that sometimes it appears quite repetitive. It's a fair enough argument, I guess, but personally I don't blame an artist who sticks to what he or she knows works best. And don't forget, Giger created art for specific reasons. The main driving force behind his creations was fear, pure untapped terror that would create visions in his head that genuinely disturbed him. Feeling the best way to cope with such anxieties was to make physical sense of them by laying them onto paper or in a sculpture. It was that attachment to fear and his fascination in what would make his artwork not only scary, but incredibly wondrous. Each time he would experiment with what imagery to create or what tools to use to make them, he would do it with such care and affection, blurring the lines between threatening and beautiful. To a point where it makes me wonder, if Ridley Scott had chosen any other artist to assist him with the design of his monster, would the film franchise even be as successful as it had been? I guess in the grand scheme of things, it's impossible to say for sure, but with absolute certainty, there has never quite been a mind like his ever since within the art world, to a point where even experts in film and media would have to step outside their very own industry just to have a piece of this creative genius for themselves. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting, and even if you're already quite familiar with Alien and Giger's work, I hope I still managed to give you one or two new facts for you to chew on here and there. Before I go, it's that time again for Artist Corner. Here I get to share some art sent in by one of my viewers, and today I'm excited to introduce you to an artist named Harrow and his collection of beautiful photorealistic black and white paintings. Harrow has had an interest in art since childhood. He remembers one of his earliest inspirations being the stained glass artwork he would notice while attending church on Sundays. He'd obsessively stare at these works of art and feel connected to the intricate details in the faces and attire of the figures, describing them as otherworldly. Harrow is completely self-taught. He would discover his preferred medium of oil paints in the early 2000s, but it wasn't until 2010 when he began to focus on the properties of portraiture. He'd become enamored in how shadows, highlights, contours and values work harmoniously. And so, he began to aspire toward hyperrealism thereafter. Through the eyes of a colorblind artist, you can now see the progression of Harrow's black and white portraits throughout the years. Such as this recent painting of his, depicting Pope Francis. Just look at the level of detail in this, it's absolutely insane. His influences include Francis Bacon, Salvador Dali, Zdzisław Bezinski, René Magritte and H.R. Giger, oddly enough, just to name a few. Many of Harrow's paintings currently reside in 8 states and 3 countries. In 2020, Harrow released his first photo book, an all-inclusive coffee table book depicting his favourite art from the early days up until his current niche in portraiture. He plans to release a new volume every year or so. I strongly urge you to head over to his Instagram or browse through his website to check out more of his stunning paintings and give him some support via the links that you see here and in the description below. If you too would like to potentially feature your art in an upcoming video, I'd love to hear from you. Please send me an email to blinddweller@gmail.com or reach out to me on Instagram. Be sure to join the Blind Dweller Art Club on Discord as well, if you want some useful art tips, advice, or to meet some fellow like-minded artists. And as always, a huge thank you to my top tier channel donators for this month. The new Ongoem 24, a Kaiser, Jose Luis Indonez, Fernando Achicalo, Chris Collins, Fruit Dookie, Blaine B, Charlie Sanchezi, Port Perea, Classy Chassis, Proxy Nil, Ken B, and Carol H. That's all for me today, my friends. See you in the next one soon. Keep being creative, and bye for now.